Welcome to our GEMA TALKS special vidcast series. I'm Rich Battista, and I am thrilled today to introduce to you all Jim McCormick. Jim is college class of 1990 and one of the most prolific songwriters in Nashville and the country music scene. He has penned two #1 Billboard country hits, Jason Aldean's Take a Little Ride and Brantley Gilbert's You Don't Know Her Like I Do. And he has written songs that have been recorded by just an unbelievable who's who of the country music world, including the likes of Tim McGraw and Keith Urban, Trisha Yearwood, and Randy Travis, and Ronnie Millsap, and Luke Bryan. And that's just the short list of who he's recorded with. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Jim McCormick.
Thanks a lot for having me.
So first off, just let the audience know how you're doing. You're based in New Orleans, correct?
We're based in New Orleans. I work out of Nashville, but
okay.
Yeah, we're holed up in our stay-at-home kind of mentality here, and the kids are doing well. We're homeschooling. I've become, I think, quite the second grade homeschool teacher, and we get into our little routine and a little cooped up, but we go for walks and doing a lot of grilling and playing in the yard. Everybody seems to be doing pretty good.
Good. Well, we were chatting the other day, and I thought a really interesting piece of the conversation was how you mentioned that with the situation we're in today, that it's in some ways altered your creative process, but in certain ways, kind of to the better, or has created new interesting opportunities to shape your creative process. So I'd love it if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience some examples of what those have been.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I mean, we talk about, my home here is in New Orleans, and about 9 years ago, I stopped being a full-time Nashville resident and came back to my hometown, and we wanted to raise the kids around the grandparents. And so since then, I have commuted to Nashville every week. And that's a little bit of a logistic hurdle, but obviously with the new situation, there's no in-person writing sessions going on anymore. And so there's, in the last 4 weeks, been no demand for me to fly to Nashville at all. Everybody is writing via FaceTime or Zoom, and it kind of evened the playing field in that regard. And so, I just dove right in, as did a bunch of my co-writers and friends. And, we've been writing as often as we can, mostly on Zoom, which I think is a superior app for a couple of reasons, but it's moved to this sort of remote writing with each other. And, I'm looking at my buddies in their living rooms, and they're looking at me under my carport. And, there's an element of inviting each other into each other's homes now that we didn't have before if we were writing at my office or their office. So in a strange way, that's a more intimate aspect of what we're doing now than being together in person. I very much miss the laughter and camaraderie in person with my friends. But this is what we've got to use right now. I think we're making the most of it, and there's some advantages to it. I think there's some things gained, there's some things lost, and there's some things gained.
Yeah, you had mentioned that because you're not traveling up to Nashville now every week, it's giving you more time to actually work on the craft versus during the commute that you're not having to do. But also, you were mentioning that in some ways it creates a little bit more of a cadence with artists that you're working with, because you don't have that pressure of, okay, I'm in Nashville for 2 days, we got to knock this out, right? It gives you a little time to breathe.
Yeah, so there's a sort of an organic pacing to things, I think, now. Whereas, even if I lived in Nashville, we've gotten dressed, we've driven into the office, we're setting aside time to write together, and everybody's calendars are booked out pretty far in advance. So it might not be easy to get back together the next day or so. With this, it feels like the process is slowed down in a couple of ways. In that way that, like, we started the song, we've got the chorus, we've got a verse or something like that going, if it doesn't feel like it's happening right now, nobody invested much to get on this Zoom session together. And maybe, hey, maybe we just take a break. And even though we're writing tomorrow, you know, do you have an hour before we start writing? Let's jump back on and just look at that second verse. So much more conducive, I think, to thoughtful writing and not trying to force it and get it done just because we're in the room together right now and we may not get to do that again. And you know, prior to this, we weren't thinking, hey, you know, let's just hop on a Zoom session. Nobody really thought of that before, right? And I think in some way, this may stay with us a little bit, especially in regards to long distance co-writers. You know, normally if I want to write with my friends in Los Angeles or London or New York, we're expected to be there in person. And so you plan a trip and all that, and that's a big logistic hurdle. And now I think that this kind of being normalized will make those long distance writing sessions much more doable, obviously, much more convenient, you know?
And what about creating, when you're creating demos? That is something that's also, it's not uncommon now to have those be done sort of virtually and remotely. Is that true?
Right. Well, you know, I mean, for a while now in the writing session, we've been kind of doing the demo as we write. So often my co-writers, I'm primarily a lyric writer, and usually I'm writing with somebody who's making the music, a producer type, and they're building out the track as we write. And kind of by the end of the writing session, we've got a certain bulk of the demo almost completely produced. How do you do that over Zoom? Very similarly, most of the guys who do that have home studios set up, and so they're writing from their home studio. And in the instance where you might have two guys who are proficient in Pro Tools or Logic or one of these programs, Zoom allows you to kind of take control of the other person's screen. You can share your screen with another participant on Zoom, and you could turn over your mouse to me, and then I can operate the program on your computer. I saw it done last week. Yeah, it really impressed me that, you know, the singer was looking to tweak how he had his input adjusted, and the producer on the writing session just said, hey, give me control of your computer, took it, tweaked it, gave it back to him, and all was settled. And I was like, oh, this is much more than just looking at each other. This is going to be fun, you know.
Interesting. So when you're a songwriter in certainly in the music business, but you know, germane to the country music world as well, you're typically a staff songwriter, like a publishing house, right? So you spent, most recently, you spent 10 years at BMG. You were there 5 years before that. You were with Warner Brothers. But recently, you've now just made a move. Talk about where you've recently moved to and what was the thinking behind that move?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm excited about it. I'm joining a company called Eclipse, and it's a small, kind of a new startup company. You know, like you said, I've been with these larger companies for the past 15 years or so, and it's a shift, but I think it's going to be exciting. It's certainly going to stir me up to be, you know, in a company with far fewer writers. The trade-off is you get a little more attention sometimes, and of course, the company relies on you to a greater degree than a big company like Warner Brothers or BMG would. But you know, at the end of the day, the job remains exactly the same. You have to go out and get hit songs, and how do you do that? You just, you know, for my money, you just keep writing. You know, going all the way back to Georgetown and Roland Flint's class, he used to tell us, a writer writes. Period. The writer writes, and you know, I can still hear him telling us that, and it's really that simple. It's like, you know, you got to get up and go do it every day. We only eat what we kill in the songwriting profession, and so you have to figure out what it is in you that makes you get up out of bed and curious to look for new ideas and always finding new co-writers and new artists to work with. You know, that's your job, no matter what kind of company you work with. But I'm excited about this new company, Eclipse. They're excited about working with me, and so it's, you know, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's a different animal than being at a big company.
Yeah. No, it'll be interesting to see how that's a different experience for you. Right. Talk a little bit about, again, a lot of the folks listening into this, some may understand the music world and the songwriting process, but many won't. So we'd love it if you'd give us a peek inside the songwriting process. How do you think about writing a song? How do you start? Do you do it alone? Do you do it with others? You know,
Yeah, no,
how long does it take you to do it? Could you kind of give us a peek into that?
absolutely. Like I said, I'm primarily a lyricist. And so I'm always looking for, long before I show up at the writing session with a collaborator, I'm always, I've just kind of got my antenna out, and I'm looking and listening for ideas for titles and ideas for lyrics for songs.
How important is the title?
I think it's essential, but of course that's where I come from, and that's kind of why I got into it in the first place. I should say I kind of came from a poetry background. I always had rock bands growing up, but when I went to Nashville to check it out, as far as being a songwriter there, I really fell in love with how much importance country music in Nashville gave to the lyric of a song. And that just appealed to my love of poetry and literature a lot. And I think, that I recognized that, that was my left hook. That was what I was going to bring to the table here in this business. And so more often than not, I am paired up with a singer and a producer or musician type person. And of course, we all speak English. We all weigh in on the lyric, but sure. I'm expected to bring more of the heft and the lyrical heft to the game. And so I'll try to come to a writing session with some ideas that I know are appropriate. At this point, after 2 decades in Nashville, I kind of know who I'm writing with, and it's almost like casting my ideas for that day. If I know I'm sitting down with you and John Alasia, I'm going to have an idea that might have a little bit of a Beatle-esque kind of vibe to it, or some kind of thing like. And so I try to bring ideas that are appropriate to the people that I'm working with for their skill sets.
But are you typically getting a track first?
No, it's funny. They kind of, I like to say any window into the house, so if we're sitting in the room, the day started off, we're having coffee, how's the wife and kids, all that conversation's over. It's kind of like, okay, what you got? What do you have? And we might play what I call the title game, where we throw some titles around at each other. Or maybe somebody says, well, I was working on a track last night and I just want to play this track. And I love that. I mean, I think that's like it's Christmas when somebody brings me a track like that. But, it's whatever's in the room. And that's another saying, is like, you really, I just try to write the song that's in the room with those people who I'm in there with. What's the vibe between us? And did anybody bring in anything extraordinary? The other part of all that decision-making at the beginning, where you're kind of at the trailhead, you're trying to decide which trailhead to go down, right? Is who's recording, or, what artists are looking for songs, right? If you've got some ideas that are just brilliant for Eric Church, but Eric's not in the room, well, Eric writes all of his songs. So just business-wise, that's probably not a fruitful avenue to go down. Let's leave that alone. If you've got an idea for, Tim McGraw, and we know Tim McGraw is recording in 3 months, that sounds like a good idea, because Tim doesn't write any of his songs. And so, unless you're writing with the artist, and oftentimes I'm doing that, if you're in the room with just pure songwriters, you're wise to size up what opportunity will what we create have tomorrow once it's out there on the market. Is there a market for what we're about to create? And kind of you can't over determine what you're going to write by measuring that aspect of things.
Yeah.
But it's not a bad idea to kind of have one eye on the door of that.
And I think there could be a misconception that songwriting is a very solitary task or solitary job, but it sounds like in your world, collaboration is critical. It's
critical. It's the coin of the realm. I think certainly in Nashville and in Los Angeles. If you look at a lot of pop songs and in Nashville, it seems like we top out around 3 or 4 writers. Pop songs have as many 6, 7 writers commonly on their songs. I was thinking about that in relation to Zoom and this sort of, tele co-writing that we're now doing. I've been on a session with 4 people, 4 guys, and it was cacophony. It was madness. I don't want to do that again. And, but had we all been in the room, I never would have said that, because you kind of can, the ear can sort it all out much better than Zoom's microphones can. Right. And so what it made me think was like, oh, these 3 ways and these 4 ways are going to get fewer and fewer. I think people are going to get back to doing 2 ways where they're just 2 writers working together.
Mm.
And what that means for publishers and for writers is that there's fewer writers on a song, and there's more publishing money for each of those writers if there's success with a song.
Right.
I think it'll also result in perhaps more 100 percenters, more songs written by one sole writer.
Right.
Because we have the time, you know. I mean, this reality is slowing us down. You know, even if you're in a Zoom session with somebody, you're forced to slow down and listen a little harder because the microphone can't sort it all out. You can't talk over each other. There's a little delay that, you know, you can't play the track and I can sing to it as easily as we could in person. So, you know, we're being called on to develop some more skills that we might not have developed otherwise, listening a little better to each other. Back to your question about how does it go? You know, once we find the idea or the track that we want to work with, we're off to the races, and it's a shooting gallery as far as building that chorus. Usually I like to write the chorus first. If we come up, you know, it's the last line of the chorus, probably finish that chorus out, make sure it's as strong as possible. You know, it's the chorus, right? That's arguably the most important part of the song. So I don't mind spending the bulk of our first hours together hammering that into something really bulletproof, and then get to work on the first verse and kind of how does the first verse lead into the chorus and set it up best, and then the second verse, and then the bridge, and then my favorite 2 words, repeat chorus. You know, but that, you know, and I'll tell you, Rich, it's like it's, you know, for myself and most of my colleagues, it's one of the most enjoyable experiences, you know, sitting down in a room and making something out of nothing, and feeling the time, you know, just getting lost in your flow, in the flow of the work, and feeling the time kind of disappear, and, you know, realizing 6 hours have gone by and we've got a song and I got to go home to dinner, kind of thing. And it's just, you know, Leonard Cohen used to say, there's no better way to redeem the day than writing a song.
Right. You know, Nashville has changed dramatically and grown dramatically over the 2 decades you've been there. Talk a little bit about how it's changed and how you've seen it change, and what's the Nashville scene like today?
It's changed a lot. I feel really fortunate that I got there while some of the older generation was still practicing its crazy ways, and, you know, there were a lot of characters still on the scene, and so I arrived there around 2000, and the you know, I think the Garth Brooks money had kind of started to dry up a little bit. Not Garth himself, but like the big boom of Nashville was starting to go down a little bit. But a lot of the guys who had ridden that boom were still around, and, you know, you'd see them in the pubs or the restaurants at noon, sitting at the bar, and you know, they were master craftsmen, and they were characters. And so you had a much more business sense start to take over, which, you know, personally fit my lifestyle better. I kind of got there when I was about 30 years old. So a lot of that was behind me. I did a lot of that in New Orleans. I had a rock band in New Orleans, and I scratched that itch just fine. I was ready to be a briefcase songwriter, as they say. Right. Yeah. And so you saw things start to change like that. I think the biggest, most dramatic change that occurred is, you know, when I got there, Nashville was still very much a country only kind of town, and country was a country only kind of music.
Right.
And slowly you saw things like Jason Aldean, who brought in real rock music into his record making and to his shows. Not that like Garth Brooks put on big spectacle of shows. You know, he says he took a lot from Kiss and bands that were big spectacle performances. But you slowly started to hear other sounds, rock music, rap music, hip hop start to come in. Well, now, you know, now we have a generation of songwriters in Nashville who grew up on iTunes and the internet, and they've never listened to a radio station that played only one kind of music. You know, I grew up where you had almost a loyalty to your radio station. You know, the fences were high between genres. If they caught you listening to another genre, you get questioned, right? What's going on? So that's the biggest change. And I think it's thrilling. It's really exciting. You know, I think country music is a big tent, and there's, you know, and the traditional country music is still there. Chris Stapleton is killing it, right? I mean, you have wonderful traditional music, but you've got all this room for experimentation
Yeah.
and exploration, and it's really exciting. And to me, as a lyricist, you know, I feel really lucky and really privileged that I get to work with, you know, some of the greatest musicians I'm ever going to meet in my life. And today it could be, you know, an acoustic guitar player who plays like Chet Atkins that I'm working with, and tomorrow it could be a young man, you know, who's making beats and filling out a track like a hip hop track, and it's a world apart stylistically.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm a lyricist, I think I kind of get to, you know, I get to play in all those fields, because in essence, the genre of country music, I think, is still looking for a lyric that reflects back to its audience,
Right.
its own lifestyle, and that hasn't changed that much. And so, yeah, some of the vocabulary, some of the phrasing changes here and there, the cadence of the rhythms, the melodies, that changes, but the imagery and the sort of mythology of country music has almost remained consistent the whole 20 years I've been there. It's really interesting.
Talk a little bit about the excitement when you, as I mentioned in the introduction, you've had 2 #1 hits that you were involved in writing. You've been nominated for 3 Grammys as well. It's incredible. But talk about that, the day you found out that first song went to #1.
It was crazy. It was crazy, and it was a very, you know, I don't want to say like everything felt right. It was a long, slow climb up to #1. It was a song called "You Don't Know Her Like I Do" that I wrote with Brantley Gilbert, and you know, the song, we wrote that song one morning at Warner Brothers. He came in, he was on the phone, you know, he's kind of on the phone. He's like, you know, I'll be with you in just a minute, give me a second, kind of thing. And he's talking to his buddy, and he's having a pretty heated conversation. And he comes into the writing room and he sits down and he's talking, and I'm like, I'm just listening, you know, whatever, thinking he's going to get off in a minute. Well, 15 minutes go by. He's still on the phone having this argument with his friend, but he was saying things that were really charged with passion and authenticity. You know, he was telling his friend, who was trying to tell him, you need to break up with that girl. No, man, like, you don't get it. You know, she's not like you think she is. And he was telling, you don't know her like I do. He was telling his friend that. And it was a good friend, because they weren't having a fight. It was, you could tell his friend loved him and cared about him.
Right.
So I just started, you know, clandestinely typing out a lot of these lines. And 40 minutes later, after he got off that phone, he put the phone down, he was so apologetic. I mean, Brantley, if you ever meet him, he's a great guy, great gentleman, very, very apologetic, very gracious, and just, you know, said, man, let's book another day. I'm so sorry I wasted your time, you know, but I think I'm cooked. I don't think I'm any good today. And I was just like, man, if you'll just look, I wrote some things down, and if you'll just look at this for a second. And I kind of turned my laptop around and I gave it to him. And I remember him just reading it and thinking, give me that guitar. and we wrote the song, you know, in a matter of an hour or so, really not that long.
Right.
And I think, you know, the speed with which we wrote it was because of how charged it was with reality, with emotion and passion, and like where he really was. And, you know, like I just described the process of writing, we kind of saw what the hook would be, what the title would be. And we just built it out of that, built the chorus up, and then we wrote that first verse and that second verse, and we had a song. And, you know, Rich, that song was kind of in a pile when I was leaving Warner Brothers of songs that I'd written with artists that had not yet been demoed. So it was just a work tape, a guitar vocal. And I went to my point man at Warner Chappell and I said, before I leave, I'd like to demo a handful of songs I've got with artists, in case, because Brantley had not signed to a major label at the time we wrote it, but since then he had signed to a major label. And so Chappell was very generous and said, yeah, go ahead and demo everything you want before you leave here, and we'll foot the bill with you. And so we demoed that song. Well, it wasn't but a few months later that Scott Borchetta at Big Machine signed Brantley and was going to re-release his first independent album, but wanted to add a few songs to it. And he asked for everything that Brantley had done already. And forgive me, Brantley, if this is not exactly all how it went down, but I think that Brantley gave him a pile of songs, and Scott Borchetta, the man who signed Taylor Swift, picked that song to be one of the 4 or 5 new songs that would be on that, added to the independent album, and then picked it as the second single off the album. And that was my first sort of real ride up past 15, past 12, past 10, past 5. And you start to lose sleep. You really start thinking like, okay, because now I'm asking questions like, you know, at the BMI office, what's the economic difference between number 5 and number 20? And they're like, oh, a lot. What's the difference between number 1 and number 5? Oh, a lot, you know? And so now you're like, oh boy, the stakes are high, right? And it happened. And, you know, like, I remember that number 1 party. I'll always remember it because it was my first number 1. I had been in town 12 years. They say it's a 10-year town. It was a 12-year town for me. But, you know, I got so many wonderful friends from every stage of my journey up there, from every step, and they were all there. I mean, I don't think one of them wasn't there. And I was so grateful to all of them. And I probably gave the longest thank you speech ever because I named so many people. You know, the guys that listened to my juvenilia when I first showed up, you know, they just like the guys who like tolerated me in the very beginning with, you know, with patience. So many good people came out, and Brantley and I had such a great time, you know, and I remember we went to dinner afterwards, and the head radio promotion guy, George, was with us, and I couldn't thank him enough because I got to see how much work goes into a number 1 song by these artists and the record company radio promotion teams who travel the country. They'll hit 2 or 3 stations in 2 or 3 cities a day.
They really work it.
They work it, and they're kissing babies and shaking hands every minute of the day to ingratiate themselves with radio, because radio, unlike other genres, I think country music lives and dies by radio. A large part of our audience is in the country you fly over, and they are listening to radio stations in their cars and trucks, you know. So that's the long story of that number 1. But I'll say this too. The other thing I like to say about it is that God wasn't going to give me a bass boat when I got my number 1. We were pregnant with our firstborn, and that was when we found out we were going to have this single running up into the top 20s and stuff like that. And so that single bought a lot of diapers and life insurance. I'll just say that. It was great.
That's great. It's a great segue to actually what we talked about at the introduction of your career path. And as I mentioned in the intro, it's I think quite unique and fascinating. And as I said, quite non-linear. So I'd love it if you wouldn't mind sharing that with the audience. I would, you know, even start maybe as you were leaving Georgetown and you were an English major and at Georgetown, and sort of what you were thinking about career-wise and what you did from there. It's a super interesting story.
Thank you. Well, we'll go back to Georgetown. I mentioned Roland Flint, and I really, you know, I don't think I ever had a more impactful teacher in my life. You know, there was something about the way that he taught poetry and the way he handled a class of writers, young writers, that really affected me. And I took one poetry workshop with him, and I jumped out of the business school and went into the college and majored in English. But I think there I discovered that I wanted to be a writer with my life, that I loved the technology of words, and I loved tinkering with them, their sound, their meaning, all of it. And so at that point I thought, okay, maybe a career in journalism or maybe a career in law. I really didn't think I was going to do music. But when I graduated from Georgetown, the old high school band of guys, they had gone to Tulane University in New Orleans, and they didn't know what they wanted to do either. So I said, y'all want to put the band back together? I mean, it was literally like that. And they're like, why not? Let's try it. You know, my father, like, just his mind was blown, right? I mean,
He was apoplectic, I'm sure.
He's okay now with everything.
Yeah, but he is. Yeah.
But I remember, you know, just that being, and it was kind of like just a placeholder, right? Go get the band going until I figure out what I wanted to do. But we were writing our own songs from the very beginning. It was about writing original music together. And
what instrument did you play in the band?
I was just the front man. I just wrote the lyrics and the melodies, and I wrote them all with the guitar player. And then on stage I just sang. You know, it was, probably, you know, very poorly borrowed everything I could from Eddie Vedder and Jim Morrison. Right? It was just a terrible thing. But it was a great time. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I would never go back to it either. But it was really, really great, and did that. And while I was doing that, the University of New Orleans opened up a MFA program, Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And so I saw that kind of out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, I'm going to jump in that and do that while we have this band. You could take a couple of night classes a week, kind of thing. So I got my master's in fine art while I was doing that. That just further drove me into a love of poetry and writing. And I really thought I was going to be an academic poet, teach in the university system and try to publish poems in small presses. But the truth is, I wasn't thrilled by the English departments. The humanities were already being squeezed by the financials. And it was just, it didn't look like a very inviting place to wind up. And so I got out of that. The band split up about 7 or 8 years later. I went into journalism. I edited a trade magazine for the coin-op amusement industry for 3 years here in New Orleans. Just happened to be located here in New Orleans and just happened to need a managing editor. And I did that for a while, and I tried playing some solo gigs, just acoustic guitar, and I really felt like I lost my way. I was about as unhappy as I'd been in that job, and I knew that wasn't for me. And during that time, I had some friends from Nashville who had seen the old rock band, and they'd always invited me up there and said, "Come check this out." And I wasn't a country boy. I grew up in New Orleans, which is, the city of the Neville Brothers and Dr. John. But I knew that there was a literary love in Nashville's songwriting community. And so I went up there and I just fell for it. It was the most amazing community I'd ever seen, of people sharing songs and sharing critique and co-writing with each other and all this stuff. And, I remember going back to the magazine where I worked and saying, "Hey, I'm going to Nashville again this weekend. I'm going to have to leave on Thursday." And the publisher saying, and we were friends, she's like, "You don't have any more time off." And I was like, "I'm not asking permission." And she's like, "Well, you're fired." And I'm like, okay, I needed that. And I really did. It was a very fortuitous firing, and it set me on my way. And so I went from doing that to, you talk about a, non-linear route. Next thing I know, I'm just hanging sheetrock and painting houses with buddies' crews in New Orleans, and filling the gas tank and driving to Nashville and sleeping on my friend's couch for 2 weeks at a time in Nashville, and writing songs with everybody and anybody who would write with me. I was writing 2 or 3 or 4 songs a day with different people, running from one office to another home studio to another office. And I did that for 4 years, for 4 years. And I look back on it, there's no explanation for it other than I was in love. I was a fool for it. I was just in love with it.
You have to be. You have to be
you have to be
like that.
You have to be. And I imagine it's like what it may be like to be an actor in love with your craft, moving out to Hollywood, and just you're living from the outside. It just looks absurd. It looks ridiculous. But inside, like I said, I was most unhappy I'd ever been in that job as an editor of a magazine. I was the happiest I had ever been, probably since childhood, chasing this dream, looking through the window at the candy store and thinking, I got to get in there. They got to give me a job as a songwriter. If I can get this is a job, I'm getting this job, Yeah. And I saw the people in the field who had exceeded their own expectations and who were really bright lights as people and as writers, as craftsmen. They were well respected in the business. They were family people. I saw a model of a life that I really wanted.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I saw a model of a life, and it was a music business life that didn't look like the late nights with the band and,
you could have a family.
Have a family, and like for my money, they're my ilk, they're my kind, but there isn't a greater bunch of folks than songwriters. I mean, it's just a wonderful community of people, really well. And so they were very helpful. And I think some of them recognized my passion for it. And because of that, they gave me their time and wrote a song with me or whatever it was, in some way. And that's kind of how Nashville works. And then, it was 4 years of kind of plugging along, meeting some wonderful people who I still am close to today. it's a funny detail that he and I both tell other people, but our first writing sessions in Nashville were with each other. Luke, Bryan, and I are old close friends,
Hmm.
and we met when we just fallen off the truck, and it was just the first song we wrote was terrible. I still have it. It's just terrible, but we've written 100 songs since then, and
Wow.
you know, and just coming up with people like that, so some of them, most of them are gone, but the dozen of us that still remain who have known each other for 20 years,
Right.
it's a great strong bond to have. And I tell young songwriters that all the time, that like, even if I write a song with them and I can kind of help them, the most important people for them to be writing songs with um, is their peer group, because those are the ones that they're going to kind of come up through the ranks with, and have those it's like going to college, right?
Right.
You're the freshman class. Stick together. You don't need to hang out with the juniors, even though they know more than you and they can show you all the tricks. You got to learn all that with your peers.
So what was sort of the cliche first big break then for you?
The first big break, I mean, I think that, well, the first major label recording I had was a band called Blue County, who's no longer around, but it was a duo, these two young, handsome men. I think one was a soap opera star. And they made an album for Curb Records, and
Sure.
somehow a song that I'd written with Bobby Pinson and Chris Bergson got on that record. The funny thing about that song is, a lot of people, I used to, like I said, I wrote 2 or 3, 4 songs a day, and I'd had some people advise me like, man, don't burn out. That's a lot of writing. You're going to burn out. But I kind of felt like I needed to catch up. Like I said, I got to Nashville when I was 30, and most of the guys were about 10 years younger than me who I was running with. And so I was trying to kind of woodshed and make my mistakes as fast as possible so that I could kind of get up to par with the professional writing class. And so, but some of the guys said, yeah, don't write that much. Well, that song that I wrote, it's called Time Well Spent, that I wrote with Bobby and Chris. That was the 4th song I wrote that day. And I hadn't been writing with Bobby and Chris that day. We were out having a beer somewhere watching some music, and one of us came up with an idea, and one of us said, hey, why don't we go back to the office and write that at 11:30 at night? And it was like, sure, let's go write it. And I remember leaving at 1:30, 2 o'clock a.m. with a feeling that like, hey, that's a great song. I have no idea what it is. We were all just out of it by that time. But that was the 4th song written that day. So I say to young writers, don't let anybody slow you down. Just keep at it. But that was a major break, to get a major label recording.
Yeah, sure.
And after that happened, a small publishing company, my very first, which was called Generator, came to me. They had found me through a couple of mutual friends, and they came to me and asked if I would like to do a small publishing deal. Your first deal, it's modest expectations. They're the ones taking all the risk. They don't know how this is going to go. And we had a bang in 2 years. We really did. I think we got 8 major label cuts in those 2 years. And then the company was small. The backer had to fold up. And so I was a free agent. And it was a great time to be a free agent because all that success had happened very quickly. And that's when Warner Chappell and I started our relationship.
Okay. You touched on a few pieces of advice for young songwriters. For those listening in who are aspiring or young songwriters or musicians, what are some pieces of advice, additional pieces of advice you would have for them?
Well, I mean, if it's about Nashville, if it's about Nashville, it's like it's hard to climb mountains if you don't go to the mountains,
Right.
and you kind of have to move there. And in the beginning, I talked
But,
about
I always say that too, and
do
people who
you?
are in Hollywood, in the movie business, TV business, you just have got to get to Los Angeles.
That's right. That's right.
You just have
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have to do it all at once. You can kind of, I did 2 weeks a month for 4 years. That's a long time, but I had a solid presence there.
Right.
And I was disciplined about it. But I think that's the first kind of thing, because so much of it is the community and the people, like I've spoken about here tonight. It's the community is going to be your way in. There is no application. There's no proper ladder that you
Right.
walk up. It's going to be your people, the like-minded people that kind of help you out along the way. So you got to kind of move there. Beyond that, I think listen to a lot. If you want to be in a certain field of music, listen to what's going on in that music. Make yourself aware of the charts and the producers' names and the writers' names and the artists' names. Study it. be a good student of the field you think you want to go into, not just for your own edification, but because you're going to be sitting in somebody's office. And if they've just released a record or produced a record and you're ignorant to that, they're going to feel that. And you want to kind of be on top of your game not overly familiar, but you just want to know what the lay of the land is that you're walking through. It shows a certain amount of respect, I think.
Right.
What Roland Flint said, a writer writes, you got to just keep doing it. You have to keep doing it and keep looking at other people's tricks. The best way to learn is collaborating with other people, because you learn their tricks. You learn what works and doesn't about your own tricks. Mm-hmm. You kind of learn who you are. And we talked about collaboration being the coin of the realm. So much of collaboration is psychology. And, who are you in the room during the creative process? You can't bristle. You got to be a good hang. In fact, I know some songwriters who have made a career of being a great hang. It's
they're
not
like
that they're
around the hoop, and then next thing you know, they're part of a #1 song.
That's right. They're not terrible writers, but they're not the most brilliant writers, but they're great hangs. And I think it's lost on people sometimes how important that is, to be somebody that others want to be around.
Really, really important advice.
It really is, and that's not to say it's who because the cost of entry is talent and passion. Everybody there is passionate and talented. Right. After that, what separates you? What kind of gives you an advantage, or at least makes you join their ranks with something to offer?
And was there I don't know, writing structures or processes that you learned at Georgetown that you could honestly say you use today, or is that too specific to say?
Yeah, no, I don't do that. I will say this, I teach a class for Loyola University in New Orleans. I've been doing it about 9 years, called The Craft and Business of Songwriting. And it is, in effect, a creative writing workshop. And I will tell you that everything that goes on in that class is a direct lift from Roland Flint's poetry workshop at Georgetown.
Give him 10% of your
he earned it. He deserved it.
Yeah.
No, I think, like back to the technology of words, just like you kind of make all of that your skill set, and it's like, if you're a musician, make that your skill set that you're bringing. But I love tinkering with words, and it's like, it's hard to put any kind of explanation, like, why after 20 years do I still passionately love this craft? And, it's just the chance to tinker with the words and find a new way to say the old thing.
Right. But creating something from a blank piece of paper is
that's a great joy.
Pretty exciting.
Yes. Yeah.
Great joy. That's a nice way of expressing it. Well, Jim, this went by fast. This was so illuminating and interesting and fun, and really appreciate your time, and good luck. I know New Orleans has had a bit of a tough time with this crisis, so hope everything is recovering there, and we're flattening the curve. And best of luck with the new role at Eclipse, and we'll be seeing each other down the road.
I hope so. Thank you, Rich, so much. Take care.
Jim. All right, it's great. Thanks.